Let us pray. God, our world runs on information, and we often feel we are drowning in data. We have knowledge available to us in an instant, at the stroke of a finger on glass. But we know that wisdom does not arrive quickly. We know that wisdom requires time, attention, and contemplation. Help us to be a community of wisdom. Help us to listen. Help us to pay attention. Help us to be contemplative. Help us to wise up, O God. Amen. The wisdom literature in the Bible is a wonderful piece of our ancient story and our tradition. It's one that we haven't focused on a lot, but it is one that has had a variety of places and influences as we've gone through our particular history. It was during the Middle Ages, the wisdom tradition was very important, and often you would see especially the feminine images in the Trinity. It is also Trinity Sunday this week, but I'm not going to tell you what the Trinity is about because it's a mystery. We experience in so many ways, and there's no way that you can define it, because as soon as you start to define it, you're defining who God is and how God relates to us. It's just the way that we are. It is the companionship, the love. And one of the things that we see in the wisdom literature in Proverbs is wisdom calling out in the square. So it's the personification of wisdom, of Sophia, or as it becomes in John's Gospel, Logos, the Word. And there is that timeless need, especially today, to hear wisdom, to hear truth-telling. It's been in all cultures, ancient and modern, and all in between. Now, is wisdom part of the Trinity? Well, it took the church almost 60 years between councils to figure out what Trinity means, and we still are trying to figure it out. So the answer is yes and no. And we can enter into a discussion around that will take 60 years if you want. But there is something in this particular story that I hope that you notice, is that wisdom has that sense of spontaneity, of joy, and of dancing. Wisdom is that walking with God, dancing with God from the very beginning. Quite a few years ago, when I first arrived in my pastoral charge in Trenton, Nova Scotia, I met Ellen and her girls. And quite literally, it was Ellen and her girls. She had 3 daughters, but she was also one of the key leaders in the Hillside Girls Club. And anyone who is a Pictonian has some sense of the Hillside Girls Club. Started by a wonderful woman who had a lot of hardships in her life, but was able to move beyond that and to create this place where girls and women could feel safe and develop and to learn about how it is so important to live with respect and courage. And so I met Ellen and got to know her and her girls, both her 3 biological girls and then the many, many other girls that had a connection with her. And I eventually got to meet Dawn, her husband. And Dawn was somebody who, really interesting character because he was completely deaf and really didn't sign either. So communication was a very interesting enterprise for me and for others. And it took me sort of the connection with the family to try to figure out what he was saying, because we did spend an awful lot of time together. In his latter years, he was struggling with cancer. And I spent a lot of time with the family and with him. But the main thing that I learned was that sense of playfulness and the wisdom and the dancing. Following his service and things, one of the girls made this for me. And it's a beautiful needlepoint. Come up and have a look at it later if you want to. And it's a poem. And it's a familiar poem that all of us have probably heard, Footprints in the Sand. Familiar with the story of Footprints in the Sand, in which, the person's trying to wonder where God is, and then realizes that when there's only one set of footprints, it's then that God carried them. So, that puts that's an important piece of our spirituality and of how we understand that we are not alone. But this particular story connects with this wisdom story today because of a lesser-known alternative to the story. How many people are familiar with the story where it ends with God and the person who is in the story dancing? I've used it at a funeral on a couple of occasions. But basically, it's that same old story where you can't figure out why the footprints are there and why they diverge and why all of a sudden there's zigs and zags and all of that going on, and the person wonders, where were you, God, when I needed you the most? And God just simply smiles and said, it was then that we danced. It was then that we danced. And part of the wisdom tradition is connecting with that sense of delight and playfulness that God has. And it's then that we dance. We need to have that connection and to see those moments. There's an alternate illustration of today's reading. And I just want to share it with you. And I'm not sure of the source. It wasn't, I'm a curator of sort of thing. You find something and then sort of curate it, move it on. So I'm not sure who wrote this. I was out shopping yesterday, and whom did I run into? Wisdom. Yeah, that she was. She called me over and we began talking, Wisdom and I. Then I went down to the courthouse, and there she was again, making a plea for justice in some dingy courtroom where somebody had been unjustly accused. And after that, I dropped by the school. She had gotten there before me, calling for students and teachers alike always to seek truth. Then I went for a walk in the woods. Moving along the trail in quiet meditation, Wisdom snuck up on me and said, now that we're alone, I have something I want to share with you. A present I want you to enjoy. You know, I have been around a very long time, really before the beginning of time. I've been whirling and dancing with God all along. I am God's delight, laughing and playing, and I want you to know the lightness of spirit and gladness that comes when you welcome me. Will you set aside those thoughts, words, and deeds that make life heavy and sad for you and others? Will you come and laugh and play with me? Will you come and dance with me? Will you? With all her beauty and grace, wisdom invites us to walk, laugh, play, and dance in the light of God's new day. Murmurations. I want to show you a clip. It's produced in England, and it's from the region of Oxmoor, which is in southern England, a rather famous place that people go to watch murmurations. And I just want to share part of this clip, about 2 minutes.
After completing their initial survey of the heath, the flocks gather for the final time, and like a massive organism, they flow gracefully through the twilight sky. If a hawk or falcon approaches, it is often confused and driven off by the sheer mass and movements of the flock.
And when you look through the lens, you just can't believe that they won't crash into each other. And then they twist and turn, come really close. The sky almost goes black with the density of the flock. Then you can hear this roaring noise in the air. And then suddenly they'll rain down like giant black hailstones. It is an astonishing thing to see as they take to the roost for the night. So, who decides whether to turn left or right? Or to form a giant sphere or a jumping line in the sky? Who sends the message that it's time to dive back into the reeds for the night? And how is it transmitted to 100,000 birds in an instant? Maybe we'll never have all the answers, and that's all right with me, because every time I come here on a winter evening, I still get the chills, and I'll still be amazed, and I'll walk home thinking, how wonderful is that?
To remind you of dancing. The starlings do that basically for safety and warmth, or what scientists have sort of told us about, and it's remarkable and beautiful, and it's mysterious. I mean, how do they do it without colliding with one another, and how do they manage to fly in such an amazingly coordinated way? And as was expressed in that particular video, we may never know. There are some theories, though, that I think are interesting. George F. Young and his colleagues a number of years ago set out to investigate the remarkable ability of starlings to maintain cohesion as a group in highly uncertain environments. And Young and others knew that, they went for safety and the things, but they also knew another thing, is that they paid attention to a fixed number of their neighbors. So how did they navigate within this system? Was that they paid particular attention to the grouping around them, and so on and so on. And the number that they came up with was 7. And this particular research is that when they were trying to figure out why the system works, it's looking at the seven. So their contribution was to figure out that when uncertainty in sensing is present, interacting with 6 or 7 neighbors optimizes the balance between group cohesiveness and individual effort. So they analyzed still shots of starlings in flight and from flock sizes ranging from 440 to 2,600, which were quite small in compared to this particular phenomenon when they came through. That was 200,000 birds doing it in Oxmoor. And they roost the thing. They come as far as 30 miles from where they were during the day in separate flocks and sort of gather to begin the process of making sure that it was safe to settle down for the night. And one of the things that they discovered is that by connecting themselves with the group of 7 around and paying attention to that's how the system works. Now, it's a mystery. It will continue to be tried to figure out, but it's so beautiful. But I wondered, is there anything that can be said for us in this metaphor of murmuration? What would it mean for us to simply attend intentionally, creatively, quietly, courageously with 7 neighbors? Just think about it. Think where you're sitting. Look around in the 7. How would your world change if you were connected deeply with those 7 people and responding to the changes in their environment and in your environment? I mean, think about your work. Think about the places where you play. Think about the encounters. What happens if you pay attention to the 7? The 7 that surround you. Think about it in terms of the churches. What about the 7 united churches in our area? What if we paid attention to what we were all going through and tried to not just react, but to move in a cohesive and way following the Spirit? Could be 7 churches, period. Or think about it if we just took 7 buildings around us. Just think about what that might do in terms of what it means to be a community hub, responding to the crisis and the needs and the opportunities within our community. And as we adjust to the challenges of our world, and as I heard from one of the candidates in the South in terms of things, that really at this point in time, despair should not be an option. We need to find ways to respond, to be creative, to look and listen carefully to the wisdom and the truth that is around us, and not do it in isolation. I mean, Cindy, you had a short reading today. I know you like longer readings, but you had a short reading today. And I could have had you do all 4 chapters of John's Gospel that's trying to figure out about the Spirit, what the Spirit means. And what John's community is simply trying to do is to respond to the crisis of presence. To respond to the crisis of presence. Christ is risen, and yet Christ is not physically present in the same way that he was before for them. How do we make sense of that? And so the community is trying to make sense of it in terms of the advocate, the paraclete, the Spirit. And the community goes on with theological reflection for about 3 or 4 chapters in John, and was just part of that. But in our context of our world, there are some examples of this murmuration metaphor. Has anyone heard of the elders? Okay. It's something that I hadn't heard of. I hadn't really significantly heard of. The Elders is an international, non-governmental organization of public figures noted as elder statesmen, peace activists, and human rights advocates. It started by the late Nelson Mandela in 2007. And Richard Branson and Peter Gabriel were people that were very sort of important in helping him form this particular organization. And it has been chaired by some very famous people, Desmond Tutu, Kofi Annan, and it's currently chaired by Mary Robertson, who is the former president of Ireland and a former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the elders don't wield power in the situations in which they work. They wield influence, and they bring international attention to problems and remind those engaged in those issues that the world is watching and that there are other solutions. And they offer some suggestions around that. It's like wisdom calling in the marketplace. And the elders have just recently completed a visit to Ethiopia. And they met with President Saleh Waqsudi, and currently the only female head of state in Africa, and with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and I'm really, really bad at pronunciation, but they met with those 2 leaders. And during the time in the country, they didn't skirt away from some of the issues. They talked about how important it is to involve women in the cabinet and in the decision-making of the country, and how to strengthen democratic institutions, and how to work especially in that context with displaced folks, with refugees and with immigrants, and to call and to point to some truth-telling about how the world is seeing them and how they might respond. Now, we have no idea what kind of influence that might have in Ethiopia or around the world, but the elders are trying to make a difference in their particular way. And then, if you noticed on Saturday's Herald, there is someone else who, again, is trying to make a difference, and Madonna. Madonna, the headline said, takes on frightening world with new album. So a reporter from Reuters says, Marie-Louise Gamunchin writes, gun control, poverty, and the marginalized. Madonna's new album, Madam X, sees the Queen of Pop wanting to fight back in what she sees as a frightening modern world. In an interview with Reuters, Madonna also said that she was horrified by moves to restrict LGBTQ and women's rights, namely in her native United States. And if you're talking about the far right and the rights that are being taken away from, say, the LGBT community and women's rights, obviously I'm traumatized and horrified, Madonna said. And on her 14th studio album, Madonna addresses U.S. gun control laws and uses the snippet of speech by school shooting survivor Emma Gonzalez in her rousing single, I Rise. A song, she says, aims to give a voice to marginalized people. Her new Madonna X alter ego is a reflection of the singer, who is known for repeatedly reinventing herself. Madonna describes herself as a curious person constantly searching for answers, for wisdom, for knowledge to understand what life is all about. All of my work is informed by the things that I learn. So that's what provokes the reinvention. So when we look at the particular opportunities that we have, and as we look around at sort of the cohorts of 7 around us, and how we can respond together and not bump into each other, and how can we listen with beauty and grace to that wisdom that invites us to walk, laugh, play, and dance into the new light of God's day. A challenge, but also a great opportunity. So let's do it, and let's color outside the lines.